Good morning, I'm Christian, this is Paul. Just quickly give you a rundown today on some pillar design stuff that we did at Appin. I'm the senior Geotech at Appin and Paul's the principal Geotech for in-depth engineering. So a bit of a marry-up project, which was nice. Basically the reason we're here today, we submitted an HRA last year, an application for non-conforming pillars. For those who don't know what that is, a non-conforming pillar for coal mines is basically the pillar needs to be 10 times the width, a tenth of the depth that you're mining at. So if you're at 700 metres, it should be 70. So anything smaller than that, you have to put the application in for. So Paul's just going to give us a bit of a rundown on the theory of pillar design, just to give everyone a bit of context, and then we'll look at how that was applied to Appin.
Okay, good morning. I'm just going to take you quickly through where we sort of came from with pillar design for coal mines and where we're at now. So the impetus for the modern coal design was the Coalbrook disaster in South Africa in 1960, when tragically 437 coal miners lost their lives due to a rapid failure of over 1,000 coal pillars, and which entombed all the workers. And as a consequence, a gentleman by the name of Miklos Salomon, who was Hungarian but was studying in the UK at the time, was recruited by the Chamber of Mines of South Africa to go and research coal pillar design. What had actually happened at Coalbrook was that, it's quite common in South Africa, there was a thick dolerite sill in the overburden, 40 metres thick. Dolerites are typically up to 10 times stronger than typical coal measure strata. They've got an ability to span very large distances. And so what was effectively happening is that the pillars, which back in those days were just really trial and error, when they were mining panels that were less than the critical span of the dolerite sill, the pillars were only loaded up to the base of the dolerite sill. When they got to the point where the panel width was significantly greater than the critical span of the dolerite then actually failed, and almost instantaneously the load on the pillars went from being due to 80 metres of overburden to 140 metres of overburden, and those pillars failed as a result. So what Miklos Salomon did was he looked at unfailed and collapsed cases in throughout South Africa with a range of parameters, but again, most of the mines back in those days in South Africa were shallow. And if we look at, this is the sort of parameters we were looking at, you can see there's a strong bias towards mines which were 100 metres or less, and small pillars, even as low as a 4-metre pillar, which, those of people who've been underground, a 4-metre pillar is a very, very small pillar, and it doesn't allow for much error in mining. One of the key things that Salomon did was it was important that the panels conform to what's known as the tributary area theory. And the tributary area theory basically says that the load on the pillar is due to a column of strata all the way to the surface, and then also sharing the roadways with the adjacent pillars. And for the tributary area theory to apply, the panel width has to be at least as wide as the depth, and preferably even wider. And even then, it's only the pillars in the centre of the panel which are actually loaded all the way to surface. And obviously it was important for Salomon to know what the load was, because he was trying to find out what the strength was. So if he didn't know what the load was, he wouldn't have any chance of establishing what the strength of the pillars were. So the final empirical formula that he first came to the formula satisfied the criteria that at a safety factor of 1, the probability of failure was 50%. But then at a probability of, or at a safety factor of 2, the probability of stability was approaching 100%. You can never actually get to 100%, but it was close to 100%. So that was his original formula, and that worked well while pillars were still being, or the mines were still relatively shallow. And that's the bottom formula that you can see on that graph. The problem was, as the mine started getting deeper, what that formula didn't do was take account of the increasing strength that you get as the width to height ratio of a pillar increases. So what Shalaman then did in about the mid-1980s, started researching a pillar formula for deeper mines, basically what's known as the squat pillar formula. And I was very privileged to be at the Chamber of Mines in those days and working under Miklos and in the research and development of the formula. So he then came up with the squat pillar formula, which takes into account the increasing strength that you get from when you've got higher width to height ratio pillars. And basically those two formulae form the basis of the UNSW pillar strength formulae, which Miklos actually helped UNSW develop and incorporate Australian data into the original database. As you can see over the years on the right-hand side, there's been an awful lot of other attempts to establish coal strength formulae with quite some variation in strengths, but there has been a lot of work in that coal pillar strength space. Oops, sorry, what have I done? Okay, another very important aspect when it comes to pillar design is the way that the pillar behaviour changes as the width to height ratio increases. So when you've got very low width to height ratios, which is the sort of situation you had at Coalbrook, if you exceed the yield stress of the pillar, you get a very rapid loss in strength. So that's what happened at Coalbrook. The yield stress was exceeded and the pillars lost strength and pretty much all of their strength, and they failed. As you start increasing the width to height ratio, initially what you get is what's known as strain softening. So you don't get that rapid loss in strength, you get a gradual loss in strength, and eventually you actually get to a residual strength, and at some point you actually get an increase in strength, which is known as strain hardening. And when you get to very high width to height ratios, you see you either get very low strain softening followed by strain hardening, and you eventually get to a point where all you get is strain hardening. So what that actually means is if you do exceed the yield stress of the pillar, you'll get some strain, but with every increment of strain you have, the strength is actually increasing. And so at some point you'll get an equilibrium set up. But despite all that work on the coal strength, there hasn't been so much work done on the coal pillar load. And as I said, the tributary area theory only applies when your panel width is wider than your depth. So as soon as you start getting into deeper mines where the panel width is significantly less than the depth, we know that the tributary area theory doesn't apply, and yet we've still been designing on that basis. And the consequence of that, as Professor Jim Galvin said in his book, is that we overestimate the load on the pillars and therefore we over-design the pillars. And obviously that has quite significant implications for the deeper mines. One of the things that I developed maybe 20 years ago, particularly to look at very small pillars, isolated small pillars, was what I call the effective depth concept. Because we do know from measurements from underground, both here in Australia and overseas, a lot of work done in the United States as well, that we do know that if we actually take out those pillars, there's a certain amount of load that's distributed to the larger, stronger and stiffer pillars on the outside. And only a proportion of that load then actually sits on the floor where we've taken the pillars out. So it's reasonable to assume then that if we know that there's a distributed load to the stiffer, stronger barriers, then the load deficit is what was actually sitting on the smaller pillars. Now, for many years, I've been really quite keen to try and extend that process and put a bit more science behind it. So I approached the University of Queensland, and together we put together a proposal to ACARP for research funds to carry out a research project around specifically looking at what happens to the pillar loads when when the tributary theory doesn't apply. And thankfully we got that approved. It was something that I've been very passionate about. I was that passionate that my time was actually, all my time on the project was pro bono, which dismayed my wife greatly. She calls it, she says, "Oh, it's your free thing." So that's just very quickly, we obviously did a literature review to see what information there was globally. Then we did some physical modelling, so we had to establish, so that we could reproduce the results, we had to establish a modelling material and make sure that we got the design of that right, we get a suitable material, and then we carried out physical modelling in the laboratory at the UQ. Our models were 1.2 metre high by 1.8 metre wide, and modelling basically narrow panels of pillars. And then we also did some numerical modelling, and so that's where we've got to. Phase 5 is hopefully we'll get an extension of from ACARP so that we can actually take some of this research and do some underground measurements. So we've actually finished all the phase 3 and 4, and we're currently writing up the report. Just an indication, well, this is something that came out of the literature review. This is from the States, Chris Mark. A whole series of looking at intact and failed pillars. But one of the interesting things you can see at depth, there's some intact cases where the nominal factor of safety is significantly less than 1, indicating that it's either that these large pillars and the panels are a lot less than the depth that they're at. So we did with the physical models. So you can see a 3-road and a 4-road panel. That black's the stippling that you can see on the model. What we've used is a technique called digital image correlation, and basically you put that stippling on the model, and then you have 2 cameras that continuously photograph the surface, and then you have software that's able to convert the movement of that stippling into strain, and because we know the properties of the material, we can then also convert that into a stress. So we can then determine what is the stress on those pillars. So it's a really great technique for this kind of research, because in the past we would have just had to put strain gauges on the model, and then any kind of failure would have made the strain gauges not work. So, but this, you can basically look at the whole model, and I mean, you can see it's almost like almost as if it's a numerical model. So it really is a technique that's greatly helped us in the work that we did. And then just one example. So this is a 3-road 2-pillar network, and As we loaded it up and then thereby effectively increasing the depth, what you can see is that there was some increase, which is to some extent a function of the fact that we're dynamically loading it rather than statically loading it. But the important thing is that the loads on the pillars is this. One is what the load would have been if it was a tributary area theory. The loads that we're actually measuring on the pillars are less than half of what the tributary area theory would suggest it should be. So we're very satisfied with the outcomes in terms of demonstrating that the tributary area theory doesn't apply when you've got narrow panels. And hopefully we'll get an opportunity to do some research underground just to confirm that. All right, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. There you go. Excellent, thank you. I suppose the work Paul and they're doing at the university are very important to sort of finally put some research behind it. The idea of effective depth basically has been in play for a long time. We've known that we can form up small pillars here and there that don't really have any effect on the system. And then more to do with the actual loading. You would have noticed from Paul's drawings that looks a lot like an abutment angle, which is exactly what it is. And we know when we take out a longwall block that the pillars only load X amount, we don't get the entire amount of loading. So the theory's been pretty solid for a long time, just no one's really put any proper paperwork to it to date, I suppose. So at Appin mine, for those who don't know, it's a conglomerate of several mines that got joined up. So the old Tower mine, Westcliff and what was Appin. So it's a fairly complicated arrangement logistically. We've got very long old roadways that we need to enter the mine through. Probably in terms of relevance for this, we're in the northern end of Area 7, which we're constrained to the southwest and the northeast. We're constrained by two fairly decent sized faults. Now, they've sort of guided the mine design, but what we found is that the closer we get to those things, the harder the geotechnical conditions are to manage. But on top of that, the harder it is to try and get the gas drained out. So that's been a real, really problematic for us. So particularly our Simpsons mains, where we're going. So on the picture there, that's a picture of our Razorback mains. If you look at the sort of larger scale one, or the zoomed out version, you should see on the top right there, there's another set of mains up there. You can just make it out. That's Simpson. So that one we skirted a lot closer to the fault. And yeah, it's been very, very slow moving through there. A lot of remote mining. And it's largely to do with the associated structure coming off the main structure. We also see just that increased stress concentration closer we get to the structure. So that's sort of what drove some of our work. We went into Razorback as a new panel last year, and we thought, okay, we've got a big fault to our west there. We really don't want to go too close to that thing. And then obviously what that means is if we wanted to push a bigger barrier between us and the fault, looking at our conventional pillar setup, it means we were going to have to sacrifice quite a amount of longwall coal as well. So it wasn't a small decision to look at. So that Razorback mains, you see there, depth's about 700 to 850 metres. So Appin's certainly pushing the boundaries for coal mining in Australia. Feels like everything we're doing, we're having to do for the first time. No one's really had to work at these depths yet. So a lot of the conventional models don't work. And for those who are paying attention, if you had to use a conforming pillar design, that means you'd have 85 metre wide pillars. So you'd be talking in the order of 500 metre wide panels for just mains drivage. So not a small thing. The Bulleye seam is about 3 metres thick. We mine a 3.4 metre high roadway at 5.2 metres width. Now, using conventional tributary area theory design, what you'd see on there is that basically our pillar centres would have to be somewhere between 51 and 56 sort of metres to achieve the conventional recommendation of 2.1 factor of safety for a mains design. everyone's sort of been skirting a bit below that for some time anyway. But as you can see, even just using I suppose the established method or the traditional method for pillar design, it's still well below the conforming pillar sizes. So even if you're doing this design, you'll still be doing HRAs for non-conforming pillars. So then basically, if we look at it from the effective depth theory point of view, what we found is we could actually go significantly less. I mean, you can see there we've selected for the Razorback mains with the 34.2 centres, so it's actually under 30 metre wide pillars, solids, which gives us a pillar factor of safety by the conventional, by the loading versus strength calculations of 8.4. But what you find is this is sort of where the work Paul and the uni are doing becomes critical. The width to height ratio of the pillars actually become the most significant factor there, because we know when we're above 8, they're pretty much infinitely strong. You've got sort of moving into that yielding zone below between 8 and 6, and the sort of pillars that Shalman was talking about originally, where you actually observe violent failure. What were their ratios about? 2, 3?
Yeah, 2.
Yeah, tiny pillars. So, we're working in a very different framework compared to that original failure. So, as I said, we've intuitively understood this for a while. So we did a fair bit of work to prove this up and put it in the HRA. So just in terms of outcomes, I suppose, or comparatively, Razorback I've put on the top there, so that's the latest panel. And then the most recent sort of mains drivages we did before that were Simpson, Tailgate 710A. You can see the width to height ratios there, so we've gone from 10 and 11.1 down to 8. We're much deeper. And then I've got some outcomes, because it's quite hard to sort of measure these things. People sort of have this idea in their mind. You go to these more smaller sized pillars that you're going to get significant deformation of your roadways and all kinds of problems and increased strata problems. And what you actually see there is I've got our roadway conversions is about 350 mil, which is not too dissimilar to what we saw in Simpson and Tailgate 710A. And you look at those standard deviations, they probably even each other out anyway. So we have not observed any notable increased roadway convergence in Razorback thus far, compared to other main drivages, which significantly bigger pillars, relatively speaking. And then the other, obviously, indicator that we thought would be important is the amount of roof movement that we're seeing. And you're seeing the two right-hand columns in there, average total telltale movement. So for those who don't know what telltales are, they're basically a bunch of wires we stick into the roof, and they're attached to a ruler, and as the roof dilates, it measures the amount of millimetres that you're getting roof movement of. So the average movement in Razorback's been about 53 mil, and then with a standard deviation of 54. So you get the odd spot where maybe the drivage is a little bit offline or a bigger intersection, and it'll jump up a bit more. But relative to the previous mains, it's certainly nothing to, you wouldn't say there's enough variation there to even demonstrate that there is a difference. And then just at the bottom of that slide, I've just quickly summarised what we're talking about for the section of Razorbacks where we ran the initial trial. If we ran them as conforming pillars, it would have been 74 metres wide. If we went with a conventional tributary design for factor of safety 2.1, we were going to have 46.8 solid, and now the pillars are 27.2 metres solid at a depth of 700 to 740 metres. So I suppose there's a couple of things, I'm not going to, it's nice not to have all the additional development drivage. That's definitely a benefit. But from our perspective, it meant we could bring the mains in away from that fault to what we considered an acceptable barrier, or a barrier to give us enough breathing room to not have to worry about it. So we're almost, it moves around a bit, but we're about between 50 and 100 metres away from it, which has given us some pretty good development ground up that way. The gas drainage has been a lot easier than it has been over in Simpson. We've still got plenty of gas at the pit, so it's still a bit of hard work, but you know, it's a very, very, very different experience compared to the other side of the pit at this stage. The smaller panel width in total, obviously that's got a pretty big impact because the amount of immediate drainage you need to do only needs to cover the panel width. So the physical area you're needing to drain to get ahead is you know, significantly less. One of the other things we were kind of hoping to achieve with it, but I guess it's hard to quantify exactly what the benefit of that's going to be, but by dragging the roadways closer to each other, we're hoping to see a little bit of relief on horizontal stress once we've driven the lead heading. So whether we have, you know, possibly gotten 5 or 10% or something benefit from that, it's hard to measure, but certainly by the roof performance that we're seeing in the convergence data, you'd say we're having a pretty good time of it down there. So yeah, I think we've sort of achieved those two outcomes that we've been very happy with. To date, it also means we've saved 870 metres of drivage in Razorback, and that's in the first 10 cut-throughs. And then for the entirety of the panel, that's 2.6 kilometres less drivage of mains drivage. So, you know, for all those who are familiar again with underground coal, mains drivage obviously it has to be done, but it's not contributing directly to your longwall, or at least its return of value is low. So you want to do as little of it as possible. What it also gave us the benefit of doing is because there was such a decrease in panel width for the Razorback mains, we obviously managed to achieve our buffer on the western side away from the fault, but it also allowed us to drag the eastern roadways in a little bit. So we actually managed to add, you know, around 50 metres of longwall coal on the startup sides. So also nothing to be to laugh at. And I suppose in terms of the experience we've had now, we're pretty happy with it. So we're going to jump over now. We're going to narrow our mains up in the Simpsons and apply the same theory there. And what it's going to mean is our eastern headings that are closest to the fault zone at the moment, we're going to bring them 50 to 100 metres away from that structure and hopefully start seeing a significant increase in our rates down there. And I'd sort of make the point too about the development distances there. Yeah, it's good for the mine. Obviously, float's always important for everyone, but it's also a matter of exposure. You know, you look at that, that's 870 metres less development that we've had to do, you know, which is 4 or 5 people on a miner 24/7 and the potential for injuries. So, you know, if you can do more for less, as it were, you know, that's got some pretty sizable safety implications, in my book at least. Yeah, I think, was there anything else sort of to add to that, Paul?
No.
No, all right, good. Look, we've been pretty happy with it. We've come up with a few technical ways to try and measure things. We've installed some stress cells, but they're notoriously difficult to do. The ones we've managed to get in haven't really shown us much useful information. All I'd say is like the pillars look fantastic down there. You walk around, you wouldn't even know. And we have come up with a better way of installing these stress cells. So now in the next longwall block section, we'll hopefully get about 5 or 6 at some pretty good strategic locations. So hopefully in another 6 months to a year, the ACARP project will be finished. We'll have some stress measurement data associated with it as well. And then we'll have 2 of these panels running with, I don't even like calling them small pillars. You call them just appropriately sized pillars.
Yeah, that's right. Certainly not small pillars. They're large pillars.
They're still large pillars.
Smaller than the ones that you'd have.
But all right, no worries. Thank you very much for your time.